To us about the passing of Fidel Castro. Mr. Mapaila, very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Good morning, ma'am.
Look, the passing of Fidel Castro, your message to the Cuban authorities?
First is to express our sincerest condolences to the people of Cuba and to Comrade Fidel's family. Of course, to all his comrades all over the world, because this was an outstanding revolutionary, in fact, the finest of modern times. And I think that it's a sad loss for all of us in the world. His contribution even to our own liberation struggle in Africa, particularly for South Africans, Angolans, Namibians. He contributed immensely, leading directly special detachments to make sure that we fought against apartheid and we freed our people. He provided us medical services. He had his doctors and volunteers staying with us in the camps, fighting alongside us, sharing the same rations of food with us. So he was just a selfless individual. And I think his greatest contribution to humanity was for humanity to recognize itself. He was the leading figure in driving what we call internationalism, solidarity with other people of the world, in Latin America, in Africa, in the Middle East. Recently, the Cuban doctors were the first to come to Africa to fight Ebola when all developing countries were afraid to come here, but there were more Cuban volunteers who were willing to risk their life. But such is because of his own contribution when he built an internationalist system within the Cuban social system. And I think that it's a great loss for all of us.
Soli, maybe a lot of people in the country might not know of the deep relations that the SACP has with Cuba. Maybe do tell us a bit about that.
We've had long-term relations with Cuba since liberation of Cuba in 1959. Immediately thereafter, when Oliver Tambo and our leaders were in exile, they initiated contacts with Cuba, and on the basis of that, the Cuban government, led by Fidel, offered political solidarity, political training, military training, as well as educational bursaries and training, for instance, for medical doctors, for us. And I think that over the years, Cuba will replace many other countries in the world as the leading solidarity destination for all our people. In fact, even our last special operation unit under MK was trained in Cuba, fully prepared and trained in Cuba. And he has since established strong relations with South Africa, with President Mandela. They had a special bond. And I think that special bond was a deep reflection of the special bond between the people of South Africa and the people of Cuba. You have noticed recently when the Cuban F5 visited South Africa, every single city where they went to, throngs and thousands of people came out to receive them, all largely in the memory of Commander Fidel and themselves as combatants and internationalist revolutionaries who contributed to our liberation. So South Africa's relations with Cuba goes deeper. They are more than brothers and sisters to us. They are more than comrades. They are everything to us. They are part of us. They are just us. And I think that Fidel's contribution to the continent can never be matched.
Look, Soli, I mean, speaking of that on the international stage, I think it's no secret that Cuba has been in hostilities with the US for over 51 years. And we know that Nelson Mandela was very pivotal in cementing that relation or that movement towards, the dialogue of peace between the two countries. And we saw what Obama did. So do you think this was, one of the attributes that he had, such a unifier?
Well, of course, Madiba was and Fidel was. The American government has, over the years, since 1961, actually they invaded Cuba, and they were defeated in the invasion of Cuba in what we call the Bay of Pigs invasion. And Fidel led that defense of his own government and democracy, which the Americans then imposed an atrocious blockade, economic blockade, ever since. Now they are trying to actually relax that blockade. But over the years, they created this bastion of attacks on Cuba. The hostility was largely from the American side, never from the Cuban side. They even passed an act of Congress, the Helms-Burton Act, which actually prohibited any trade with Cuba by any other company that can do trade with America. I mean, it was just a special way of ill-treating Cuba, but largely because they didn't want Cuba to succeed as a communist country right in front of the US. But unfortunately, and fortunately for us, Cuba did succeed. And actually, you can see that in terms of Human Development Index, Cuba ranks amongst the best in the world in terms of life expectancy and all of that guarantees for basic social rights. They are all enjoyed in Cuba than perhaps in most of the developing countries. So despite that kind of hostility, Cuba demonstrated its maturity in handling the relations quite well. I remember recently, for instance, Miss Hillary Clinton even said, no, these new changes in Cuba heralds the demise of socialism. And President Raul Castro said, no, he's here to build and defend socialism, not to destroy it. So the socialist system is strengthening and deepening in Cuba. And I think in his memory, we'll see the best example of social solidarity in the world through Cuba.
Look, Solly, you speak about the blockade. Let's talk about what the sanctions actually did or affected Cuba.
The sanctions which were imposed through the blockade cost hundreds of billions of francs. In fact, we are understanding that there's even a system in which the Cubans are trying to see if the Americans can be forced to pay some form of reparations with regard to the impact of the blockade in several billions, which impeded part of development of Cuba. But overall, I think those sanctions were the worst kind of a thing that could happen to modern world, where people were punished for choosing a social system, for wanting to become communist, for being collective, for fighting against exploitation of another human being or a group by the other, for standing for their freedom and rights, and also for offering solidarity to all the oppressed people in the world. So that has not succeeded. The socialist system in Cuba had succeeded. It actually shown us that common humanity and a better world is possible.
Absolutely. And Solly, I mean, let's talk about the recent developments now. We know that the U.S. has a new president-elect, namely Donald Trump. Do you think it will continue with the project that was started by his predecessor, Obama, to mend those relations with Cuba?
Well, we're not quite sure about that.
How beneficial would it be for the two countries just to...
Well, I think there's been great strides, of course. We don't know how far irreversible are these strides. We hope that he can continue with that particular process. It will be foolhardy for him to change the kind of progress that has been made. The most essential part is that Cuba is an independent socialist republic that must be respected, and therefore the Americans must just lift the blockade entirely and scrap the Helms-Burton Act that continues to have measures that punishes any relations of any people and countries with Cuba. So we can be free to trade with Cuba all over the world and never think that if you trade with Cuba, you can't therefore trade with America. So I think Mr. Trump will not actually reverse the progress made by Mr. Obama, although we would have felt that Mr. Obama could have completed the entire project before he leaves office.
And very quickly, Solly, before I let you go now, is there any way that the SACP and the South African people in general are going to honor Fidel Castro?
There's no doubt about that. We have to do something. We're just immediately consulting with each other in the alliance and our youth formations, as well as with the Embassy of Cuba, Ambassador Carlos. We had a discussion with him this morning, and the Friends of Cuba Society. We will sit together, all of us, and plan a befitting memorial and tribute for Commander Fidel.
Maybe, Solly, just very quickly before I let you go, what can you tell us about maybe the ongoing relations that South Africa currently has with the Cuban nation?
We have very strong relations with Cuba. You remember that Cuba continues to train some of our professionals, doctors. Their doctors actually are the first doctors here to go and heal our people or treat our people in the remotest rural areas of South Africa. They don't question where they go. They go to where there's the most need, in the barest of areas where there are no resources. They go there and survive and treat our people. We are now extending that program towards other sections, for instance, technicians and so forth, because they've got a highly skilled society, educated society. In fact, they export skills. It's one country in the world that specializes in the exportation of skills. So because of that, South Africa has been a huge beneficiary. They are also training hundreds of doctors, South African doctors in Cuba. And I think that no other country has ever contributed immensely as the Cubans have to our country. They fought for our liberation. Their soldiers died on the African soil. When they left, they never took a single carat of diamond with them. They only took the remains of their departed soldiers who had fought in so-called foreign land, fighting for the freedom of South Africans, the Angolans, Namibians, and others on the African continent, and in Latin America, and the Middle East, and everywhere else. So this is actually the country that has represented what humanity should be.
So you mean we should strengthen our bilateral ties with the country and maintain that relationship with Cuba, even though we have sovereignty with the US as well?
Yes, of course, we have to strengthen the bilateral relations. In fact, Cuba has over the years strengthened its own bilateral relations with the peoples of Africa. Only those that were controlled by imperialist forces have decided to sever ties with Cuba. But I think it's important that we should maintain these relations, deepen our friendship with the people of Cuba and the government of Cuba. And I think we have more to benefit. But also, we should have a particular way to pay the respect to the Cubans who died fighting for our freedom and who never wanted any payment or reparation for anything for the loss that they incurred in the fight for our liberation. Fidel sent over 35,000 military and technical personnel to Angola specifically to repel the apartheid government in later what is commonly known as the Quito-Cana Valley battle, which actually was the decisive battle that forced the South African apartheid government to go to negotiations. And no other country could do that to save an independent African country like Cuba did. So the relations, they should be first-grade relations. In fact, they should be first amongst the equals of all other countries, our relationship with Cuba. And Fidel is the main person that actually cemented those relations. And of course, his special bond with President Mandela and of course with the people of South Africa.
So basically he's the curator of our history.
No, of course he is. He had made huge contributions.
Solly, thank you so much for joining us. That is the SACP's Solly Mapaila joining us here in studio to talk to us about the passing of the late great legend, the president, former president of Cuba, Fidel Castro. We're going to take a quick ad break. More news after that. Do stay with us.